Like Cordova, Capacitor comes with its own plugins to use to access native functionality, some of which are included by default with Capacitor, and some of which are created by the community and shared with other developers. However, Capacitor is a much younger project than Cordova, and many people rely on plugins that are only available in the Cordova ecosystem. Now, fortunately for those of us who want to use Capacitor but still want to use those Cordova plugins, most Cordova plugins are compatible with Capacitor by default. A lot of the time it is as simple as running npm install and then the plugin that you want to use, and you'll be able to just use that Cordova plugin in your Capacitor project. So Capacitor does an excellent job of automatically migrating Cordova plugins to Capacitor in most cases. However, some plugins will not work by default without additional configuration, and there are some plugins that are just not compatible and won't work with Capacitor. For a list of plugins that are currently known to not be compatible, I'll have a link in the description that you can check out. So in this video, we're going to do a technical walkthrough of how Capacitor automatically migrates a Cordova plugin. So the main benefit of understanding this process is that it becomes more clear what you need to do to finish manually migrating a Cordova plugin to Capacitor. Let's say you install a Cordova plugin and it doesn't work. You will have a sort of means of investigation for figuring out why that is and how to fix it. And aside from that, for some people, the technical details of how this process works might just be interesting, and it might end up being useful in other ways. We'll be focusing on Android specifically in this video. Okay, so let's get started. I have the Cordova plugin Facebook 4 plugin up on screen right now. So this is the one we're just using as an example to run through how the migration works. And I also have a written blog post that covers this same plugin if you're interested in reading that. So basically we're just going to go through this step by step. We're going to install this and then just walk through what is happening. So to get started, what we're going to do is install this plugin into a Capacitor project. So all we need to do is run npm install and then the name of our plugin, Cordova plugin Facebook 4. We'll hit install. And the reason we are using this plugin specifically is because it's a reasonably complex plugin, and it also makes use of these Cordova install variables, which cause us a bit of trouble when we're trying to use plugins in Capacitor, but we will talk about how to get around that. Okay, now that that has finished installing, we're just going to run npx cap sync, and that is going to pull that plugin over into the native project. It is worth keeping in mind that I've already set up Capacitor in this project, and I've also already added the Android platform to the project as well. If you're unsure on how to complete those steps with Capacitor, I'll also link to the basic getting started documentation in the description as well. Okay, so that's completed now, and if you look at the messages here, you can see that it's found that plugin that we've installed, so we know it's getting pulled over into our native project. And if we just quickly bring up Android Studio, we don't really have any context for what is happening on Capacitor's side of things yet, and we're going to take a much more structured approach to this. But if we just go searching through our project, we can actually find where that plugin was installed. So if you open up the project files here, expand our Android, we can see something called Capacitor Cordova Android plugins. So that's probably a good place to start. And if we just expand this out, keep opening all these files, eventually we will find a reference to Facebook here. We have org.apache.cordova.facebook, and then we have connect plugin. And this is the native Android code for the plugin itself. So let's just quickly open that up, just have a peek at it. And what you see in here is just Java code that is going to be integrating with that Facebook SDK. And this is what our application is going to be communicating with. So from our application in the web view, we'll make a call using a JavaScript API, which will eventually call these methods in the native code and then send us back the results. So you can see here we have things like on resume, on pause. There's probably some login methods in here somewhere. some game request dialogues. Let me just do a search here for, I think it's get login status is one of the methods that this plugin provides. So you can see that method's being provided here through this execute method. So that's not too important. We don't really need to worry about this too much because you don't usually need to do anything with the native code here. We'll just use the Cordova plugin as per normal when we're using it in our application. But we can see that that plugin has been pulled into this project. But if we try to run this right now, it's not going to work because we are missing those install variables which configure your Facebook app ID and things like that. So it won't work, but you might be left at this point thinking, well, what do I do? It's worth noting that when you run npx cap sync, it'll often have warning messages that pop up for things that the native projects require. So it'll have sometimes information in here that you can just copy and paste to get everything configured, but not always. And we don't get any messages like that for Android here. So what we're going to do then is take a look at this Cordova plugin Facebook for project itself, the actual plugin files. And what we can do is open up the plugin.xml file. And this file is basically instructions for Cordova on how to configure the plugin correctly for the native platforms. But this file is also what Capacitor uses to migrate the plugin over. And basically what happens in here is all the different entries we have in here serve as instructions for how to configure this in the native code. So we can kind of follow along and see what's happening, where it's happening, and what is missing when Capacitor tries to set it up. And so you'll see a few different XML tags in here. We're going to focus specifically on stuff contained within platform name equals Android because this is the instructions for Android specifically. And you'll see in here we have things like JS module, config file, source file, framework. So these are all different types of instructions that Capacitor is interpreting. And it's important to remember that these are essentially instructions for Cordova. This isn't how Capacitor works, but Capacitor is able to interpret this to migrate the Cordova plugin over to Capacitor. So what we're going to do is just go through step by step here, see what the plugin.xml file is expecting to happen, and then we'll inspect our native Android project and see what is actually happening and whether we need to step in and configure some things ourselves. So before we get started, I just wanted to give you a little tip on how to find out what all this stuff does. This isn't the kind of information you'll find in the documentation, at least not yet. So a good way to find out what exactly is happening is to just look at the source code for Capacitor yourself. And that might sound a bit intimidating if you're not used to doing that kind of thing. But what we can do, for example, if I'm looking at this and I'm trying to figure out what does a JS module do, what does this mean exactly? And so what I could do is I could just see what Capacitor is doing when it's using that. So if I search for JS module in the Capacitor GitHub repository, I can see what it pulls up. And you can see here in the plugin.ts file, it's making a reference to JS module. If I pull up config file, for example, I can see that there is another file where that's being referenced in the CLI/source/Cordova. So you can just open these various files up and then you can see what is happening. So it might be a bit hard to figure out exactly or quickly, but you can sort of step through this code and try to figure out what is happening with those plugin.xml entries. And usually it's just a matter of looking at this code and then that will call some method. We have plugin entries here. We can see that's an array. So then we could then see what happens with plugin entries somewhere else in the code. And it ends up being this long sort of daisy chain of different things you end up following along, but you can figure out quite a lot on your own if you stick with it kind of thing. So I'm not going to show you what's happening in the Capacitor code for every step along the way here because it would just take far too long. So I've already sort of done that research side of things myself, so I'm just going to talk through at a more high level what's happening here. and we'll reference our Android Studio project as well where necessary. So this JS module entry here with clobbers, which is a pretty weird tag name, but what this means basically is this is the code that provides the API for the plugin. So if we actually take a look at Facebook native.js, I'm going to open this up in it's in a separate tab here from the Cordova plugin Facebook 4 repository. So that was referencing www/facebooknative.js. So let's just have a quick look at that. And what you'll see here is this is a file that is exporting various methods. And these methods are the methods that we use to interact with this plugin, like get login status, login, check has correct permissions, logout, API. So this is what we would actually be using in our application. So this is providing the methods to the browser that we will be able to use. So what this instruction here means is that we want to grab that file and then we want to set it up on the Facebook Connect plugin namespace. And so what that means is that it'll be available through window.facebookconnect plugin. And that's how you would interact with the plugin if you're just using the default Cordova way of using it. If you're using something like Ionic Native, that would then be wrapped and you'd use it in a different way, but we won't worry about that for now. So basically this is just setting up those methods in the browser, and what Capacitor will do, I guess this is a pretty easy instruction for Capacitor to interpret. It'll just take that JavaScript file and it will inject it into the web view for Capacitor, and that will make it available to us as well. So next up we have the config file entry here. And what this means basically is we're trying to provide some kind of XML configuration here. And in Cordova's case, it would be adding this XML to res/xml/config.xml. This isn't exactly what Capacitor does. What Capacitor will do basically is look for any config file tag that has a target that includes config.xml, and it will put them all in the same file, and you'll be able to find this file at app source main res xml and then config.xml. So you can see here that this XML has already been added. This feature section here has now been copied into our config.xml file. But one thing you will clearly notice is that it didn't include all of these access origin tags here. So an important part of what Capacitor does here is it will only copy over these feature tags. So anything else is going to get ignored. And so this is where it's important to understand this process, because all of this stuff isn't going to get copied over. And if this is important to how the plugin works, then this might be something that we need to configure ourselves manually in the native project. Now in the case of the Facebook plugin, it's not required. Since we already have a wildcard access origin here anyway, none of these should matter because they're going to be allowed. And this sets Android Min SDK version of 15. And I believe the Capacitor Min SDK version is already 21 anyway. So that's not going to make a difference either. However, there might be cases where there is something that is required here, or let's say, there was a different Min SDK version required that wasn't already satisfied by Capacitor. What we could do to set up this preference manually is actually just add this to our capacitor.config.json file. So what we can do is open up capacitor.config.json, which should be in the root directory of your project. And under the Cordova section, we can add a preferences object. And then you can just add whatever preference that you want to set. So if we were setting Android Min SDK version, we could set that to 15. And that would then be copied over into our native project when we run npx cap sync again. So just to see that happening, we'll save that. And let's again take a quick look at our Android Studio project. So we see it's just that one entry there for now. But if we jump back into here, run npx cap sync, and then if we jump back into our Android Studio project, you'll see that pops in there. So now we have that preference in there as well if we needed it. I'm actually going to get rid of that because it's not required in this case, but I think it's important to show how to do that if you need to do it. And another important thing to point out, I think, is that you can see here that this config.xml file has ended up in res.xml config.xml, which is exactly the target that is specified here. But this is just, I guess, a coincidence, or the way this is set up. Capacitor will only ever add config.xml entries to this one file. If this target was something else, like res/xml/some plugin /config.xml, it would still get added into this same file anyway. The target here doesn't actually matter. It only matters that it has config.xml in its name. Another important point that we will get to in just a little bit is that aside from looking for config.xml, Capacitor also has different behavior for entries here that have a target that includes Android manifest.xml as well. But we'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so moving on to the next section here, we have source file and then source Android Facebook connect.xml and a target directory of res/values. So what Cordova is trying to do here is create this Facebook connect.xml file. And then in this next section, it is trying to set some values inside of that file. So it creates it, and then we target that file and add some configuration to it. But we just discussed how Capacitor will only copy over values if there is config.xml in the target file, and it will copy those into this file that we've been working with here. So since this is Facebook connect.xml, it's actually just going to get ignored. So this whole section basically is like nothing happened, at least in Capacitor's view. It will, however, create this file still. So if we go into, let me just close this, Capacitor Cordova Android plugins, and go to source, main, res, values, we will see that there is a Facebook connect.xml file that is created, but there's nothing inside of it. It's just an empty resources tag. So what we want is to have all of these values that the plugin is going to use. We want to have those in this file, but we don't. So this is where those Cordova install variables come in. It wants to replace this app ID, app name, Facebook hybrid app events. It wants to replace those with the values supplied when installing the plugin and then add them to the project, which would then make these available to use throughout the Android project. So generally, if some value, some string or boolean or whatever kind of variable is trying to be set up by the plugin, there's a good chance it's doing that for a reason, and it's going to want to make use of that value. So this is something that we're going to need to set up ourselves usually. So we're not going to add the values directly to this file. What we can do is just go to our main application up here, open up source, main, res, values, and in here we can store any variables we want to use throughout the application. So we can set up our strings and booleans in here. So basically we can just look at what the Facebook plugin was trying to do here. So it's trying to set up this FB app ID, FB app name, and FB _hybrid _app _events. So we can just set those up ourselves in this file. So I'm just going to paste those in now. So I'll save that, and now the plugin is going to be able to make use of those values. Another good thing to do, not specifically required, but if we open up that connect native file again, was it connect plugin? So if we open that up, what you can do is just search for those values in this code. So I might search for FB _app ID to see how that value is actually being made use of. So in the case of the Facebook plugin here, it's not actually making use of any of these variables within the native code here. So Technically, we don't need to add these. It's just later in the config that is making use of these. But sometimes these values will be referenced throughout the actual native code. So it's generally best to get these set up properly in the application. Okay, so let's move on to the next section, which is the Android manifest.xml file here. So you can see this is another config file tag here. And as I mentioned before, any config files that don't have config.xml in its target name will be ignored by Capacitor, except for ones that have a target of Android manifest.xml. So these are values that the plugin wants to add to the manifest file. And these Capacitor actually does handle automatically for us. Basically what will happen here is it will copy it into the Android manifest.xml file that is within the Capacitor Cordova Android plugins folder. So if we open that up, we can see that we have these exact values here, activity and 2 metadatas we have right here, which has been added automatically. And you can see that it's also making use of those strings that we created. So it's going to pull those values in from this file. And when this application is built, it'll take this Android manifest.xml that's going to get combined with any other Android manifest.xml files in the project to create the final manifest. Okay, so let's move on to the next tag here, which is this framework tag. And it has a source of com.facebook.android, Facebook Android SDK, and then it wants to add the Facebook Android SDK version here. So what this will do basically is Capacitor will see this and add it to the capacitor.build.gradle file as a dependency. So if we open up this file here, we can see that this has automatically been added for us. Under dependencies, we have implementation and then the value that was supplied in the plugin.xml file. And so you'll notice here that it has a value of 5.13.0, which might seem a bit magical because we never actually supplied that value. So what will happen is Capacitor will look to see if a preference is set for Facebook Android SDK version. And in this plugin.xml file at the top here, there is a preference supplied for that version number. And so it's just going to use the default value that's supplied. But if you didn't want to use that default version, it is also possible to overwrite this value. You can't do it in this file because, as you can see at the top of this file, it says do not edit this file because it's generated every time that a sync is run. So any changes you make in here are just going to get wiped out. But what you can do is open up the Android folder here and open the variables.gradle file. And if you set the version as a variable in here, it will use that value instead. So if I add a new line here and say Facebook Android SDK version, and let's just create just a random version number, let's say 5.9.0 for example, that's the version we want to use. So we'll save that. And now let's run the npx cap sync, which is the same as update in terms of the native project. A sync will just run both the update and copy commands at the same time. So I'll run npx cap sync and we'll wait for that to finish. And now if we jump back into the Android Studio project, and you can see we have this implementation line here still, but this time we have Facebook Android SDK version left as just a placeholder variable here. And what will happen is this will be replaced with whatever values are in the variables.gradle file. And so you can see here, since we have Facebook Android SDK version, that is going to use that value there instead. So that leaves us with just one more line to look at here for the Android platform, and that's another source file entry here. And so this is just it trying to create the connect plugin.java file. So in terms of Cordova, the Cordova plugin itself, it's saying where to grab that file from the plugin project, and where we want to put it. And as we saw before when we were just clicking around, we can see that that file is indeed copied inside of org.apache.cordova.facebook, which is what it's trying to specify there. And then we have our connect plugin.java file, which is providing all of the native code for this plugin. So in the end, for this plugin, there was actually very little we needed to manually set up. Mostly it was just setting up these variables, which in a lot of cases is probably all you will need to do. But if you follow along this process, there may be some cases where there is additional things you need to configure. And this is going to make that hopefully pretty clear because you'll see what Cordova is trying to do and what Capacitor isn't adding to the native project, and then you can just do it yourself. In a lot of cases that will probably work, but there may be cases where the plugin just isn't compatible. Okay, so I hope you found this video useful. If you did like it, do feel free to leave a like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.